Welcome to the Ascent of Mount Carmel YouTube channel. In past installments, we talked about how Orthodoxy helps to make our souls fitting altars for God. So it's probably good to take a step back and devote a whole installment to this subject. I'm pretty sure that I have some subscribers that aren't Christians, and I think that perhaps they're subscribing because they're researching Ascent of Mount Carmel. They're looking into different paths for spiritual enlightenment, and I thank you for subscribing. However, I want to caution you.
Danger, Will Robinson! Danger! No, Will Robinson! Danger!
I want to caution you, if you're reading this book, you probably shouldn't practice asceticism at this time. The reason for this is because the sacrifices that you'd be making wouldn't be sacrifices for God. They could be sacrifices for yourself and trying to increase your knowledge. And if you do this, you're more likely than not going to open yourself up to diabolical influences.
You see, while we purge our desires, we are trying to make an empty space to make room for God. Now, if we empty ourselves out, and God isn't allowed to fill that space, something else will, and it's something that we don't want.
And I'm not just trying to pick on non-Christians, because St. John of the Cross in Ascent of Mount Carmel, in the second book, warns Christians who are trying to ascend of Mount Carmel that there are diabolical influences that can take grip of us if we're not very careful about the path which we take. That's why Orthodoxy is so important to us while we try to ascend Mount Carmel. It's our armor to protect us so that we don't deviate. I could probably devote an entire YouTube channel to the subject of Orthodoxy, but I have a mission to this channel and I don't want to deviate it from it too much, so I'm going to try to make this video brief. And the first thing I'm going to do is try to describe 75 years of human history in about 30 seconds. We'll start with the aftermath of World War II. People had witnessed incredible changes during the war. As people mobilized to fight a true world war, mankind saw that the atom had been harnessed. In the war effort, huge leaps of technology were made, and in the aftermath of the war, that technology was put use to creature comforts, consumer goods that helped increase the standard of living. Everything seemed to be new and better. And in that frame of mind, everything that was old was viewed with suspicion, or it was just not as good as new. And a moral relativism crept into the general culture. Because if everything else had changed, perhaps right and wrong could also be changed or nuanced. The only thing that was really holding back the floodwaters of relativism was the Catholic Church. Though there were certainly cracks in that dam over the previous 50 years or so, in 1960 the floodwaters really started breaking loose. That, not coincidentally, was the year that John the 23rd refused to reveal the third secret of Fatima as he had been instructed to do by Our Lady. And now we have two generations of Catholics who have never been really catechized unless they've gone about it and tried to do it on their own on YouTube or on the internet. And the majority of people who call themselves Catholics really don't have the slightest idea what Catholics are supposed to believe, and they really don't care. The only time they go to church is to have their kids baptized, maybe, or if they're going to a wedding. And what's worse is that we have poorly trained priests who are going through seminaries and haven't really been trained the faith fully, and so how can they pass that on to the faithful? Also, we have unfaithful people throughout the hierarchy of the church. I therefore suggest that you be very skeptical of every new innovation, devotion, canonization, and every change that has been introduced to the church since about 1960. Most of the practices that have been introduced would seem very foreign to St. John of the Cross, and he is our benchmark. What he would accept is what we should be willing to accept. What he would definitely reject, we should reject. Now, some of these new things that have been introduced were specifically condemned by St. John of the Cross. So let's briefly discuss what is, or more precisely, what is not orthodox. To condone abortion is not orthodox. To use or even condone birth control is not orthodox. Ecumenism, at least in the way that term is now understood, is not orthodox. To say that there is no reason for proselytization, that's not orthodox. To say that there is no need for non-Catholics to convert to Catholicism, that's not orthodox. To say that there is salvation outside the church is not orthodox. To participate in interfaith worship services, that's not orthodox.
To say that there is a reasonable hope that all men will be saved goes against Scripture and is not orthodox. And finally, to say that divorced and remarried couples should be allowed to receive the Eucharist is not orthodox.
These things were all condemned by the church prior to 1960. There are other YouTube channels that address these things and probably would do a better job than I can do. If you want to send me an email, I can direct you to some of them. I also suggest that you make it a point to avoid the Novus Ordo Mass. For those who aren't familiar with what Novus Ordo is, that's what's called the New English Mass. But the English Mass is not just a translation of the Latin Mass. It's extremely different, and it's extremely irreverent. By the way, if you type Novus Ordo into Google Translate, the translation into English is New World Order. Now, there are a lot of good reasons to avoid the Novus Ordo Mass. Below, I am providing 3 different links to YouTube channels that take that subject on, and they're from 3 completely different perspectives. You should probably make exceptions for special occasions, such as baptisms, communions, confirmations, and weddings. So if you do find yourself at a Novus Ordo Mass, try to make it a point to go into the row that receives the Eucharist directly from the priest, because it's very irreverent to receive communion in the hand. And if you're taking it from a so-called extraordinary minister, that person has already taken it in their hand. So maybe go around to the back of the church and make sure you get in the right row. And when you do receive the communion, make sure you receive it reverently on the tongue and don't just snatch it. Now, the whole point of this channel is self-denial, and fasting is a big part of that. The old order was to fast for 3 hours before the reception of communion, and I definitely suggest that you do that, if not perhaps from midnight the night before. For the second half of this video, I'd like to discuss the Catechism. Generally, people nowadays use the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, or the New Catechism, is a pretty good book, but still, it's not an infallible document. It was introduced relatively recently into this culture where the only mortal sin is to judge somebody. So, not coincidentally, it's missing any mention of the spiritual works of mercy, which include admonish the sinner. Even the much shorter old Baltimore Catechism, which was for kids, included the spiritual works of mercy. Now, to be fair, the Catechism of the Council of Trent also does not include the spiritual works of mercy. However, I, like most traditional Catholics, prefer the Catechism of the Council of Trent. That too is not necessarily a perfect document, but it's better than the New Catechism. For instance, the word admonish appears just once in the New Catechism of the Catholic Church. In the Catechism of Trent, the word appears 69 times. In the entire Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a big book, hell is only mentioned 11 times. And this is despite the fact that Jesus talked more about hell than anything else but his divinity in all the Gospels. In the Catechism of the Council of Trent, hell is mentioned 294 times. Subscribers of this channel are familiar with the benefits of fasting and the importance of fasting. Fasting is only mentioned 9 times in the New Catechism of the Catholic Church. In the Catechism of Trent, it's mentioned 24 times. The Catechism of Trent was released in 1566, so it was the catechism that St. John of the Cross would have used. Enough said. I'm recording this installment during the first week of Lent, and due to the nature of this channel, the following passage from the Catechism of Trent is probably of interest to viewers. But as every blessing is to be obtained from God by holy prayer, the faithful are also to be taught sometimes to abstain from the marriage debt, in order to devote themselves to prayer. Let the faithful understand that this religious continence, according to the proper and holy injunction of our predecessors, is particularly to be observed for at least 3 days before communion and oftener during the solemn fast of Lent. Thus they will find the blessings of marriage to be daily increased by an abundance of divine grace, and living in the pursuit of piety, they will not only spend this life in peace and tranquility, but will also repose in true and firm hope, which confoundeth not, of arriving through the divine goodness at the possession of that life which is eternal. In an earlier installment, I mentioned that most people who are trying to ascend Mount Carmel are usually on a journey by themselves. Therefore, if just one member of a married couple decides to abstain from marital relations during Lent without having an agreement with the other party, that's kind of a miserable thing to do to your spouse. However, perhaps you're making this ascent of Mount Carmel, you're both reading Ascent of Mount Carmel together, and you're both depriving yourselves of certain desires. Well then, if you're both in agreement that this is something you want to do with Lent, you're probably a 1 in 10,000 couple. And you probably already know that God has blessed both of you immensely just to allow you to find each other.
I can't see loving nobody but you for all my life.
So we have a couple more installments that we're going to do before we get back to the beginning of Book 2. The next one we're going to do is going to be on prayer, and then we're going to do a very brief one on wearing a scapular, and then we're going to go headlong into Book 2. In the meantime, please pray for the church.
I can't see